My name is Sonia, and I come from Spain, originally. I've been living here for 14 years, and the last couple of years I've been a little bit more active in a libertarian socialistic organization called Motmacht. And the reason for that is that because I identify myself as an anarcho-feminist, and I'm going to present a little bit of what I believe from my ideology, why is it important actually to be very aware of the rise of the right-wing populism from my ideological perspective. I think Stina has explained very well why is it so important actually to debate this issue, that actually it's happening all over the world, like you said. I think it's important to be aware that these right-wing movements are very dangerous for the most of us, and they start with these rhetorics that are excluding anybody that is not a male, white, able, middle class usually, Christian, that's very important. So of course then you have this, the majority of us, we don't belong in that norm, right? And the problem is then that when you use this kind of rhetoric, they speak for the common people. You have heard that, right? Of this, when they're in the parliament and they talk that, no, we are here to fight for the common people. Well, the common people is us, and is a diversity that they cannot represent. Their ideology is based on hierarchy, on inequality, and that's why, as an anarcho-feminist, I see, I'm completely the opposite, politically speaking. I don't believe in that there's such an inequality. There's diversity. It is, and that's very good. That is our strength. But I don't believe in any hierarchies. So speaking of which, now I have some minutes to present. As an European feminist, and as you can see, I'm pretty light in my skin color, yeah, which makes a difference, because sometimes I think I've been missing in the debates, especially here in Norway and in other parts of Europe, this self-critical view from feminists in what role we play when we are silent when this right-wing populism is raising. I think we have to be much stronger, much more clear, that we don't agree with the way they think, and that we, at the same time, I think we have to be very aware of our privileges as white, able feminist. That's what I've been missing, this critical opinion about, but because, right, when we share the same struggle, we are different feminist groups, but we share the same struggle. And this is because this right-wing populism, they try to control us while they dehumanize us with the way they talk and the way they let more violent groups behave in the streets. They allow that, actually. And this rhetoric, the way they speak, is canalized also by this authoritarian state-organized abuse. They want them to have this kind of excluding politics. So what they do with women, actually, is that they objectivize our health and our bodies. They want to decide for us like we are objects. And they demean our ideas. Everybody has been out there thinking that all these feminists are complaining again, right? Yes, of course we do. But at the same time, the worst part of all of this is that they deny our human rights. And this is what I think that we, European feminists and Western feminists in general, have to be much more critical about. We really have to be out there saying it, that we won't allow this. Especially when you see, again, fascist movements and Nazis marching out in the streets. I really would like us to reflect much more about these privileges we have. Historically speaking, actually, what we have to be critical about ourselves in Western countries is actually that we see ourselves as pioneers in fighting for women's rights. which is pretty an ethnocentric thing, right? Because we are not. It's just that because of our condition, when we were the places we are born with, so we tend to be more heard and seen. That doesn't mean we have any more power than our sisters, we don't, but we tend to be more seen and heard. And that gives us this privilege, actually, and the responsibility. And it's mandatory that we need also to see our other brothers and sisters that are sharing the same struggle. And they are being excluded, and they are being threatened by this right-wing populism. Speaking of which, sometimes, again, perhaps I don't know how many of you know about this anarchist philosophy, as I would like to call it, is a political movement too. But when we speak about Western feminists and this critique I've been thinking about, it's not just being aware of our privileges. I think we can do a lot of work with that. But the other one is that we have had a tendency to tell other social movements and other groups and other women's groups how do they have to organize, how they are going to fight, right? And we come and we tell them that we know best, right? We think we've been doing this for a long time. And we keep centered in this idea that, again, we know best, and we go ahead and we tell them what to do. This is kind of false empowerment we think about. And the problem is that as an anarchist, I think that, for example, when we think about that we need to fight to break this glass ceiling, everybody's so busy here in the Western. I always think that, fine, we always have some women that are allowed or they are capable of breaking this glass ceiling. But I always think that the structures remain the same. I mean, you can, by all means, break a ceiling, but the structures of oppression are still standing. And that's what I want to get rid of. I don't want that. And what I know is that there's a lot of social movements and women's movements out there everywhere, and here are some representatives or people that are a part of them that think like me. I don't think I'm very much as radical. It's that we live very good here in Europe, right? We have made this system that we live with these privileges, and we live very good. So what I would like to take some attention to is that actually we need to get rid of this right-wing populism. Since we share the struggle, we really need to be allies in it, without we European feminists seeing ourselves like, we have the solution. We don't have any solution. We don't. We have different solutions. We have to gather and find methods, different methods, to get rid of this struggle. And it's violent. It's in politics. That's a very big problem that perhaps we will talk about later. But I actually think that the only way of getting rid, not only way, but one of the ways of getting rid right-wing populism is gathering in solidarity across borders. We anarchists don't believe in borders. We want to get rid of them too. Yeah. So the thing is, right, that we are going to discuss a little bit more later, but remember that our struggle must be fought based on solidarity upon our differences.
Thank you. It's really interesting what you said, that we shouldn't tell other women what to do. Of course we shouldn't. We should support other women's struggles, even though they look different than ours. So, and you also talked a bit about state-organized abuse. And you know more about that. So, Nursel, please.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be with you here today. I'm the representative of international representation of Kurdish women's movement. And I'm really pleased to be with you today and to share our experiences of struggle, especially against this terminology that we tell fascism. For us, I will continue to write my speech because this is the first time that I'm speaking in English, then Fascism is not only an act, it's a mentality which has been constructed during a long time in the story of humanity. This is certainly the most violent aspect and practices of the patriarchal system. Related to their historical origins, ethnical and gender identities, the Kurdish women have been confronted to different types of oppression. We can describe fascism in different ways. As an ideological approach, fascism consists to colonize, occupy, eradicate territories, but more of that, the mind of the population, to make them slaves of a system of domination. Certainly, in those cases, which are available for all humanity, on the beginning of the institutionalization of the patriarchal system, the most vulnerable part of the society were women and children. But also, the harmony between nature and women were affected by monopolization, politics, which are one politics of monopolization, then state nations politics, I will underline it, one identity, one belief, one flag, one language in place of freedom, submission, and in place of communality, individualism. The description of fascism can't only be connected with racism. This is just one aspect of the reality. Fascism can also be a political and military way to establish the pillar of the domination system. But that can include also many sociological aspects, like violence against women, lapidation, women stoning, and feminicide practices. The Kurdish women who are living in Middle East, North Kurdistan, the part of Turkey, South Kurdistan, the part of Iraq, West Kurdistan, the part of Iran, and East Kurdistan, West Kurdistan, the part of Syria, and East Kurdistan, the part of Iraq, from many years are victims of fascism on political, economic, cultural, and social level. Those territories which are in conflict situation, in another meaning, this is the center of a third world war. Women and children are victims of state violence, militarization, and also victims of new and summit phase of patriarchal system like ISIS. The Kurdish women's movement is organized everywhere in Kurdistan against the fascism of Erdogan in Turkey, of Daesh, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, especially in Shengal, of the dictatorial regime practices in Iran. For example, to be more concretely on the situation, especially in Kurdistan of Turkey and in Turkey in generally, sexual violence increased in Kurdistan as a result of intensification of political conflict. It increased throughout the country after the state of emergency was declared in July 2016. 50% of murders of women were committed under the state of emergency conditions. Almost all incidents of overt violence against women in the public domain are being disregarded by the prosecutors and considered to be minor offenses, which would give the predator the opportunity to be tried without being arrested. The state of emergency declared after the coup attempts in Turkey, 15th of July in 2016, was extended by the parliament. Since its declaration, the ways had been applied targeted women's efforts against male-dominant mentality. Tens of thousands of people have been dismissed from their jobs in the public sector through statutory decrees which mostly targeted women. Civil organization, association, almost women's association in Kurdistan, foundations, newspapers, and periodicals have been closed. Thousands of academics, writers, journalists, and politicians, including members of parliaments and the chair of the opposition party, mayors, elected local administration officials, and activists have been detained and arrested. I would like to give you some specific statistic. I don't like so much to speak with the statistic, but I think it's important for this situation. As a result of 7 statutory decrees published in the official gazette between July 22, 2016 and January 16, 2017, 103 people were dismissed. As of February 2017, an additional 4,464 public servants were dismissed, bringing the total to 97,567. It has been reported that out of 2,514 workers dismissed from 11 labor unions associated with KESK, Public Sector Workers Union, 574 were women. Most of these women's associations gave joint or individual statements declaring that women's struggle will continue in spite of all oppression and women will be persistent in their activities. A statement said, "They can seal our doors, but they cannot lock down our struggle and spirit." 176 people were murdered in the basement of atrocity in Cizre, Şırnak, between 6 and 8 February 2016. KGA members, Free Women's Congress, this is the Kurdish women's movement in Turkey, Asya Yüksel, Bergin Demirkaya, Şehriban Altınışık, Feride Yıldız, Gülistan Üstün, and Derya Koç were among those who were burned to death in the basement by the Turkish state military forces. To struggle against this fascism, Kurdish women's movement have many tools and structures to fight these fascist acts and mentalities. The first of them is popular education, academies and assemblies which are still not forbidden or closed by the government. Change the mind of the society is the most important work to do. To mobilize the public opinion under the oppression, to continue the actions and demonstration is part of the struggle. Anyway, the women continue to publish all those atrocities in social media and international press to show to the world that in conflict situation, the fight is not impossible. Another concrete example is the case of Yazidi women. On 3 August of 2014, ISIS attacked and captured Sinjar, which is the historical homeland of Yazidi, a Kurdish religious minority whose ancient religion is linked to Zoroastrianism. ISIS destroyed Yazidi shrines, executed resistors, and demanded to the residents to swear allegiances or be killed. During the ISIS massacre in Sinjar, up to 5,000 Yazidis were executed. Almost 200,000 people managed to flee. 50,000 Yazidis fled into the Sinjar's mountains, where they were trapped without food, water, or medical care, facing starvation and dehydration. At the same time, approximately 5,000 Yazidi girls and women were captured. They were appropriated as spoils of war and sold as sex slaves, men to men, or given to ISIS commanders. Those who refused to convert were tortured, raped, and eventually murdered. Babies born in the prison, where the women are held, were taken from their mothers to an unknown fate. Women, allegedly raped by ISIS members, have committed suicide by jumping to their death from Mount Sinjar. While a high number of women managed to flee or could be liberated, approximately more than 1,000 women are still in ISIS captivity. The women who were liberated by Kurdish guerrilla forces and YPG Women's Self-Defense Unit then started to organize themselves in a confederal democratic system structure. Now we have different women's organizations. The one of them is TAGE, the Yazidi Women's Assembly in Europe, an organization in Europe. And their assembly organizations, and many structures. How can we construct a common front against fascism? First of all, we must join our reflection, our forces to build a collective initiative of struggle based on common action in political and social level. We must be activists on the ground, but also a voices on institutional level to establish a political pressure for the application of decision mechanism. In UN and European Council, send international observer delegation to report the real situation of women which are living in conflict area. Parallelly, we must empowering our street demonstration to sensibilize the public opinion, establish social projects for women which are victims of physical or psychological trauma, of war, or systematically violence by state, or domestic violence, which are the result of this ideological fascism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nursel, on the update of the situation in Kurdistan. It's a bit alarming to hear that men's violence against women has increased after the coup attempt last year, and also that almost 100,000 state employees has been dismissed. So this is a country which is allies to Norway through NATO. So I think we should look who our friends are. And also for everyone who's interested in the Kurdish women's movement and their struggle, Solidarity with Kurdistan is hosting a conference in Oslo on the 18th of November, one whole day, with Kurdish women speaking their ideology. So we have these ones here. You can just get them from Seher. She's sitting there. So please sign up. So now we're going to go to another continent who's also had problems with right-wing populism and its effects on women. So Lina, I'm going to let you talk a bit more about the situation in Colombia.
Thank you, Stina, and hi, everybody. First and foremost, thank you, Women's Front, for arranging this panel. It is consisting in a lot of big topics that might be quite difficult to gather in only 1 hour. But nonetheless, this is a very important issue to talk about, and I'm glad that it's finally on the table and with an international panel. My name is Lina, and I was born in Colombia. I grew up both here and there. This is why I was invited to come here, to take you to a little journey to Colombia, to understand what's happening both in Colombia and in Latin America when it comes to right-wing politics and the way it affects the woman. And to start to talk about the situation in Colombia, we first have to just put out there that the way fascism is explained here is quite similar to the way we understand fascism, but in Colombia we don't use that term as wide as here in Europe, because we weren't affected in the same way. What we do have is a higher power or right-wing political forces that are systematically attacking the woman through their politics. They are attacking social movements, and they are killing us. So this is, as my colleagues here said, a lot of forces that need to be discussed and affects the woman all across the world. Also, to understand the Colombian situation, I think there might be a lot of ways to start explaining, but I think what might be interesting to talk about here today is that there are several ways the women are affected. from the right-wing politics. And we can, in one way, talk about the situation of the woman in Colombia, as it has been, as it always has historically. And we can also talk a little bit about the role of the woman in the Colombian peace process. Because as you might know, Colombia is coming out of a very long peace process and has been affected by a conflict which has been going on for over 50 years, maybe 60. So not knowing how much you guys are aware of this, I'm gonna explain the conflict a little bit, because there are a lot of actors in the conflict. And in one way we have the government military and the government forces. In another side we have the guerrillas, FARC guerrillas, which in this case is the one that has signed a peace agreement with the government, which has a communist ideology and comes from a left side. And then we have the right wings movement with the paramilitarism. And in between there, we have the social movements and the women's movements. So this conflict has been going on for too long. And it has its roots in the way the government has distributed unfairly the goods. So that's the conflict. I don't think I'm going to talk that much about it. But what has been very particular in this peace process in Colombia, comparing it to other peace processes in the world, is that the gender perspective and the woman's perspective was taken seriously and was actually a part of the peace process. But not without a fight. Because when the peace process started and the negotiations between the government and the FARC guerrilla started, they didn't involve women, and they didn't take the notion of the woman's role in the conflict as victims, as participators, and such. It wasn't before the women's movements and social movements stood up and said, what is happening? We are half of the population, we are half of the victims. Why aren't we being included? And not only included in the negotiation as such, as being talked about. We didn't have any women there around the table, and that pissed a lot of people off. So what happened next was that this was taken in concern, and then the peace, the negotiation table decided to create a subcommission on gender issues. And this has never happened before when it comes to peace agreements. So now the woman had a special role in the negotiations. And they said, listen, if we're gonna make peace, we have to include the woman, and that was the slogan, no peace without the woman. And first and foremost, they needed to understand how the war has affected the woman in particular, but also the woman in general has been affected in a differentiated way in Colombia. Not only were they the mothers of the children that went to war, not only were they the family members that was lost, there were also guerrilla women participating in the war and taking two weapons, and they are also the peacemakers. So when it began this whole peace process and the peace agreement that had a lot of main topics, such as the distribution, thank you, distribution of the land. Here, women said we also have the right to own our territories, or also when it comes to repairing the effects on the victims. Here, women stood up and said we have been treated in a different way during the war. especially when it comes to sexual violence in the war, which is a well-known strategy to use women as trophies in war and sexual violence. So here it is. Colombia is a very complex country, and also during the time of the conflict, Colombia was known and had the highest numbers when it comes to internal refugees. So that aside, I'm looking forward to discuss a little bit more further how the right-wing politics and movements in Colombia have affected the women specifically. We can talk a little bit more about that, I hope. And then I'm really looking forward to listening to how we, what we can bring to the table, what we can take from this meeting, and how we can gather as an international group or movement, call it what you want, to stand in solidarity with the women around the world.
Thank you, Lina. I thought it was interesting about the women participating in the peace process, because what we know is that peace process tend to go way better when women are involved, and they tend to last. And also in rebuilding countries that has been torn by war and conflict, if women are involved in the decision making, we tend to put our pressure on infrastructure, on healthcare, on that kind of stuff. So we have different kind of values that we put to the table when rebuilding a country that has been torn. So thank you for that. Now we're going to talk to Pierrette. You know a lot about the situation in Europe. Well, I'll just let you explain more of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Pierrette, and I work at the European Women's Lobby. At least it's my last week at the European Women's Lobby, so I'm going to share some information about the reality in Europe, some data, but also some of my personal thoughts. So I know the European Women's Lobby is working on the issue of right-wing, far-right wings, and they will also do some work, but it's going to be a mix of different things. And I also wanted just to build on what Lina just said, because she talked about a situation of war. I was reading a document made by a Swedish NGO about patriarchy and nationalism, and they looked a lot at the Balkans. And you know that there was a big war in the Balkans recently, and the war led to the creation of a lot of far-right and almost fascist group, because war means you have an enemy. It means ethnicity, and therefore it means the role of women into keeping your own group against the other. So I just wanted to bring this issue of how war is also a ground for a fascist group to use women for ideas that are not what we as women's movement what we want. But I wanted to take you through a little tour d'Europe, a little tour in Europe, just to let you know what the situation is in terms of far right. It's not going to be super positive, but I think it's good to know. And then I will discuss with you the impact on women. But I will go quickly in different countries. I will start with Austria. Last year there were elections, and the Freedom Party won 35% at the presidential election. This is a party that is against migration, against the political establishment, and the background is that 90,000 people applied for asylum to Austria, which is 1% of the population. So they really played with the threat of migrants and refugees. Then we go to Denmark. The Danish People's Party was second at the general election in 2015, 21%. And now the coalition that is governing depends on them. They oppose multiculturalism. And maybe you know, but the police can seize the money and the goods of the refugees when they come to Denmark. So that would be a way for refugees to cover the housing and the food. And they also cut the migrant benefits. So it's a clear vision about migration. In Finland, the Finns party went also second in the 2015 election. They are in the coalition government. They are against migration. They want strict controls, and they support a lot rural Finland. It's also interesting to see that they focus on the rural areas, and they focus a lot on welfare policies that would support women at home. In France, my country, the Front National was second at the presidential election. So everybody had to vote for another guy that we didn't really choose, but because we didn't want her. That's an interesting. That was the second time in France. It's interesting that the leader is a woman. I think we can also discuss that in terms of strategy, and I will talk about that a bit later. But Marine Le Pen formed a new European group in the European Parliament, which is called the Europe of Nations and Freedom, together with Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Italy, and I will just talk to you about how they work in the European Parliament, because now they exist as a group. That also means that they receive funding from the European Parliament to exist and to have staff and to have budget. In Hungary, the Jobbik party won 21% in 2014, and they are in power now. They are against gypsies and Jews. Someone was talking about how they let people perpetrate violence in the streets. They have some kind of brigades of men who would go in the street and would find the gypsies. Orban, the president, built a razor wire fence along its border with Serbia to stop migrants from coming in. They are not in the European coalition that I just mentioned because they are too anti-Semitist for the other coalition. It's interesting. And another way to threaten women by fascists is also to control them, control the NGOs through financial control. Our members had to go through a financial control for 2 years, so you cannot do anything, you are controlled, and they were trying to find the very, very reason to just stop the NGO. And that's also something as a strategy that they use. So I just wanted to conclude that it's important we look at history, what's happening in different regions, because it's as you said, it's a very important topic, but there's so many different subtle things to look at. And it's interesting to look at her story, the story of the women's movement, and to understand how the women's movement have been working around, sometimes in favor of fascist groups and sometimes against. It's very important too.
Thank you, Pierrette. We have the same debates here about getting paid to stay at home. It's called kontantstøtten. We have also made a song about it. Yeah. Maybe you can perform after. The people are here, I think, who wrote the song about kontantstøtten. Okay, I'll see it. Okay, whatever. It's also interesting that you brought up masculinity or toxic masculinity in the terms of fascism. And I'd like to kill Öcalan before I go, because he said, kill the dominant male. And that kind of gets the core in this issue, I'd say. But now we've been hearing all these stories. But I'd like to be more concrete. In Russia, for example, they have implemented laws that allowed men to beat their wives. Trump has made it harder for women internationally to access abortion. Erdogan says that childless women are incomplete, and we've seen a rise in men's violence against women. What I'd like to know from you, Lina, maybe, how does fascist or right-wing populist work in parliaments in Colombia, and what kind of women's rights are they threatening?
Only that. Well, in Colombia, there's no secret that there are certain politicians and political parties that have used several strategies to go against the fundamental, not only human rights, but women's rights. If we look at it in a general conception, what is quite particular in Latin America countries is that the right-wing movement or the political parties have really strong ties with the church. And religion is very important in our countries in Latin America. And they have a certain definition on gender roles. Maybe we have not talked enough about the role of like the masculinity perspective of it, but they know a whole lot of what should be expected from a woman. So they have attacked women's rights in several ways when they come together. Mainly, it has been the woman's reproductive rights and the right, for example, for abortion. And there are several examples across South America where the right-wing politicians or the parties have stopped programs for the women to be allowed to have legal abortions. And just to get that clear, in several South American countries, abortion is illegal. It is only legal to make an abortion or have an abortion when it threatens the woman's life, when it's a consequence of a sexual violation or rape, or when the fetus has some health issues. Otherwise, the women are not allowed to have safe abortions. This results in a lot of high numbers of abortions taking place unsafely. And this is a problem that women have across the world where the governments are generally right-winged. And in Peru recently there were also a very specific case where the social movements and the women got together to file to change the politics and have safe abortions in a result of one particular case where a woman was raped and she wasn't allowed to have a safe abortion. And what the government did was to manage to stop that. And how they did that was that they said this gender perspective is nothing we want to be participating in, or the women have a certain role in the society and this has to be maintained. The same things have happened in Colombia, and I am really concerned. And by the looks of all of your faces, you are concerned too. That's good. But in Colombia, yeah, it affects several ways. But when the church and the right-wing movement come together, they are in more danger than separate. And just to have another example, during the peace process, the whole agreement and the gender perspective took a lot of place, and the gender perspective was supposed to be like across the whole agreement, right? And I don't know why, but the government decided that, okay, because of democracy, but the government decided, okay, when we have signed this agreement, we let the people vote if they agree with this peace agreement or not. And guess what? The right-wing politicians, with Uribe in hand, which is a well-known right-wing politician in Colombia and worldwide for his cruel actions, they gathered with the church and got together and said, let's go against this agreement, not only because they were against the peace process and a lot of the negotiations that were put on the table, but also because the agreement had a lot of gender perspectives, and they have LGBT perspective, and it offended the idea of the nuclear family, basically. So they managed to have the population vote no in the votes, in the, what's it called? Yeah, you get it. So it was 50.22% against the peace agreement. And it was only because the gender perspective. So that's another great example
that's
how
a
they
bit
did
depressing.
it. Really depressing.
Yeah. So Pierrette, can you give a couple of examples of what types of women's rights that are threatened in Europe by fascists?
So I think I gave you already some, but I want to maybe let you know a bit, because you're asking how they work in the parliament. And it was interesting because I've been at the European Women's Lobby for 8 years, so I've seen the previous term and the new term with the far right, the super increase of the far right. They have 27 members of the European Parliament, I think now. So they are a group. So you can see some of them are clearly against women's rights. Some of the parties I mentioned are clearly against women's rights. Some are using women's rights when it's about migrants coming to Europe and how those migrants are going to threaten our women. So that's also very interesting to see that they never care about women's issues except when it's about refugees who are coming to Europe, which is a very hypocritical situation. So the problem comes when they are in coalition in a government. And this is where I think we could also question the democratic parties who agree to make coalition with far right to win. And we go back to politics. People want to win because when they are in coalition, then there are some consensus to be made with them, and they can blackmail. In Belgium, for example, we have a liberal government with the far right from the Flemish part, and of course, it means in terms of migration, a lot of attacks on migrants. In terms of economic policies, it's attacking a lot of women. So that's the reality. In the European Parliament, it was really striking for me, the first Women's Rights Committee meeting after the elections in 2014. They were the new MEPs, members of the European Parliament, and some of them were from the far right, from Germany, from Austria, etc. And every 2 seconds that someone was mentioning something, they were coming with subsidiarity. Because, you know, in Europe, there are some topics that are dealt at European level because the member states agreed it has to be European-led, and some topics that are national competence. And so what they would do is every time they would come, no, we cannot discuss this, this is national competence, subsidiarity. And that's the main topic was reproductive health and rights, because of course abortion is a national topic, there's no EU competence. So one of the strategies is that they disrupt systematically discussion. And there's no discussion possible because they would take the floor and they would say, we cannot discuss, it's not European topic. So they've been blocking debates. When there are some resolutions being discussed, they would come with an alternative resolution. And this is how they completely destroyed a report about sexual rights, which was a good report. And they came up in the plenary in Strasbourg with an alternative resolution saying that sexual rights is a national competence. We don't have to discuss, full stop. So the resolution was 2 lines. Of course, it was adopted because the majority of the right wing would vote, even the soft right wing. I can say that the French right wing in the European Parliament is the leftish part of the conservative. But they would vote as a bloc. Can you imagine the rest? The Polish or the Czech. They would vote against the gender equality parts in the documents in the European Parliament. And they would also... that was interesting, the mention of the church. In some countries, when they ally with the church, then they also allow for attacks on women's rights to happen in a more subtle way. So, for example, the right to consensus objection, which allow doctors to say, no, it's again my belief, I'm not going to perform an abortion. It's rising in some countries because they just let it happen. In Italy, in Austria, the same in on contraception. So that different techniques that they use, including in parliament. And
yeah. We've had exactly that kind of debate here too. I think it was 3 years ago when we were like 10 or 15,000 marching to keep our abortion rights as they are. I just got a little note here that we have to fasten up a bit. But what I find interesting when we talk about nationalism and fascism is that the woman is celebrated. The role of the woman as a mother is celebrated, and they praise so-called traditional family values. But can the nation state work as a tool to oppress or liberate women in times when nationalism is rising? Can the nation state be a threat to women's rights? I'd like to hear your opinion.
Especially if you ask about the Turkish government now, the state's nation of Turkey, with the election of the AKP party in the power of the Assembly, National Assembly in Turkey, still now from 2007 until now, 10 years, more than 10 years, and maybe before. Now, unfortunately, most of the MPs, most of the politics elected person in National Assembly are from the AKP government.
Yeah.
Then, when I speak about the monopolization of the society, when I speak about the monopolization of everything, of the body of the person, of the meaning of the person, of the identity, of the religion, of the flag, of the language, I'm referring to this new concept of the Turkey. I'm referring to this empowering of the monopole system. Then for Erdogan now, everything has a role in the society, and the woman has a role to be a woman, just only a woman, connected to the traditionalism, to the customers' law, to the to be a servant or to be a slave, to be a second person in the society, second class, we can say that. Now, Erdogan, not just only from the democratic peoples in Turkey, but also from different states in Europe, in state level, but also in public opinion in Europe, is considered as a dictator leadership now, because I think it's connected with the regression law in Europe too, this regression in Turkey. The problem is that he would like to form a new model of society.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember, when the AKP was in the government in the beginning of the election until now, they tell the AKP as a moderated Islam party. But now we can see that this is an instrumentalization of the religion. This is a politic instrumentalization of religion, which is going on in Turkey now. And the role of women, before there were a Minister of Women and Social Affairs. Now there is not. And when during the election of Erdogan, that was a woman from AKP, Fatma Şahin, and she didn't know everything about women's rights. She didn't defend any values of women's right or feminism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine that she support the thing that every woman must have 3 children? That the women cannot laughing in the public space because it's shaming. Many things like that. Then they want to create a new type of woman now in Turkey, with the leadership of new sultans, Erdogan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think that this is really related with all the regression in the world, and the democratic peoples or the democratic modernity forces in Turkey, in the Middle East, and in all the world, fight against this kind of approach, political approach, ideological approach, and maybe now everybody knows in Turkey that the women's struggle will continue under this kind of conflict, under this kind of pressure, will continue. And the difference of the HDP, the opposition party, which the co-chairs are, two of one are in prison now, Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ. The difference, political and ideological difference, is that the HDP project is embraced all the components of the society. The women, the LGBT, the youth people, the religious people, everybody in a collective way. And this is a danger for the sovereignty of Turkey. This is a danger for the democracy in the Turkey, for the liberty in the Turkey. This is a danger. Therefore, everybody see during the last referendum in Turkey that the half of the population vote no to the referendum, just 1% between yes and no. And you can see that everybody is disagree with this politic. But unfortunately, European Union, United States, and many international forces have many connection, politics, economical, military connection with these states which are a member of European Council, and therefore they cannot do something concretely against Erdogan and the regime.
Thank you. What you can hear is that no matter if you're in Colombia or in Kurdistan, fascism and religion goes hand in hand in most countries, and that kind of connection is not always talked about. That I think we should talk about that more often. We're running out of time, but the thought with this panel was like to see how should we work together? How can we show solidarity with other women who are victims of fascism? So, Sonia, I'd like to hear your thoughts. How can we work in solidarity and stand together in this struggle? Very short from everyone. I'm sorry we ran out of time.
Well, that's a big question for a little time. But I will try to summarize what I think, and I went into it a little bit at the beginning. What I think we have to see is that, again, our struggle is common. You've been giving wonderful examples from different countries. At the same time, I think the panel here has been very good at examining the different factors that has made, actually, that right-wing populism has been gaining so much space. But to say it shortly, you talked a little bit about the state-nation and the role it has, and religion is very important, and most of the time it's just not speaking about. What I think is, as long as we have state-nations with very strong borders, like the last 30 years in Europe is the time in history that we have had more borders, actually. Like you actually said, that we've been building actually more borders. As long as we have, and we think and trust that a state-nation is going to look after our human rights, because that's what they are, as women, these basic human rights, as long as we think that a minority that have different interests, like you said now, right? International interest is like a kind of this imperialism that goes through. As long as we really think and believe that the state-nation is going to give us our rights, we are going to keep on sitting here and waiting. This is not going to happen. I think through parliamentary system, only there we are not going to be able of gaining this struggle. So I think we have to think, how are we going to work in solidarity? As I said initially, well, we need to forget that those boundaries exist, these limits, territorial limits. No, again, everything you're explaining about, we share it in a minor or a higher degree, but it's there everywhere. In Europe, in the US, in Latin American countries, in the Middle East, in Australia and Africa and everywhere. So that's what we have to understand. In order to work in solidarity for our women's rights, we need really to start thinking that parliamentary systems are not going to help us with that necessarily, because again, having women it hasn't been helping. You said that. We have to be very critical to that. And at the same time, don't forget that many of our struggles, the small fights that our predecessors have won for us, they have been fought outside, not in the democratic system.
Thank you, Sonia. So, Lina, I saw that you want to say something about that, so I'll let you have the last word in this panel. Yes.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that with or without a state, there are several ways we can work together in solidarity when it comes to fighting the right winds and the women's oppression. So for a Colombian perspective or Latin American perspective, we need to understand this. The way the organizations are formed or are working in Europe are not equal as the way that we organize the people in Latin America or in Colombia. And we need to understand that the situations are really different. Because in terms of, for example, Colombia, we can't only talk about women's rights in general, because we have a huge diversity of ethnicity, race, and cultural aspects in Colombia. So we need to talk about the indigenous woman, we need to talk about the rural woman, the woman from the city. You know, we have to understand that the situation is not as easy as it might hope to be. And in Colombia, we also need to see that the whole gender perspective or woman's perspective has not come to this. The understanding of gender perspective are mainly being held within the academic area, and we need to fight more to get it more in the streets and with the population, with the people, and that's why I think the peace process failed in the first time, and also it has been difficult to implement some agreements in the peace process, because Colombia needs to start the conversation about gender and women. So it hasn't been easy to do that, and I think when we understand the situation is different in Latin America, and we have several issues to talk about, we need to then make more pressure in our states, for example, the Norwegian states and the participation of the Norwegian state in Colombia. And we need to do a lot more international lobby. And that's something we can all take from this and start working.
Thank you, Lina. I saw Pierrette. Very short, very short. Okay.
I just wanted to give you a quote that I read in one of the documents I read to prepare to understand the root causes. It says that if we look at if we look at the project of the far right in terms of inequality between women and men, we could say that the right is the fundamentalism and the left is the everyday religion. It's just to say that it's important that we also understand what's going on now and how it's important to look at history. I was quoting the book of Gloria Steinem about Hitler to understand what the lessons we can take from the past, because every time there was a great progress for women's rights, there was always a backlash, and the backlash can be in, of course, the far right, it's very visible, but that's also in the left and democratic parties that are just making it happen, because it's all about power and about masculinity. So I would say to work in solidarity, it's important that we take the time to understand in the diversity of the countries, the background in each country, the histories. For me, that's something I find super interesting, because we learn a lot. We are not coming from today and find a solution now, but also to be able to learn from other countries when they have decided to go that direction. Did it work? It didn't work, and to be flexible with the concepts, because we are from different cultures and backgrounds, and nationalism is not necessarily bad in some context, because that also gives women a sense of what they're fighting for. So it's very important to understand and to discuss and not to go from it. And I would say in Europe today, when we see the rise of this far right, it's also important to discuss with those people to understand them, because if we don't at all try to understand, we will just be blocked in two groups. and how do we want to create society together. So discussing doesn't mean that we agree. It means just at least to have a little bit of understanding to be able to come with a better vision that would make them come on our side.
Well, that's interesting. I think we have different opinions. Some think that direct action is the way to handle these people, and someone wants to talk to them. It's different. But with this one, I will finish this panel. Thank you so much, everyone who came here. So interesting to hear your perspectives, the situations in your countries, and I'm very happy you came to our conference. Thank you.